walls are breached. Run for the gates. The city is burning.
1,500 years before Christ, the Eastern Mediterranean was one single world. Cities gleamed under the sun with a prosperity never seen before. Palaces rose majestically. Trade flowed endlessly. No one imagined that in 3 centuries, all of it would vanish under the ashes. But before we understand how this world was destroyed, we need to grasp its magnitude. Because what existed between 1500 and 1200 BC wasn't just a bunch of scattered kingdoms, it was the first truly global civilization in human history. A system so sophisticated, so interconnected, so advanced, that its collapse would change the course of humanity forever. If you're finding this fascinating dive into ancient history intriguing, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss out on more stories like this one. Imagine a world where an Egyptian pharaoh sent letters to a Hittite king in Anatolia, calling him brother, where Babylonian princesses crossed entire continents to marry Mycenaean monarchs, where amber from the distant Baltic ended up adorning the tombs of Egyptian nobles, while African ivory decorated the palaces of Greece. This wasn't a dream. It was the everyday reality of the late Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire dominated vast Anatolia from its capital Hattusa, a fortified city whose cyclopean walls still impress those who gaze upon them today. Its kings controlled territories stretching from the Aegean to the borders of Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, in the Nile Valley, New Kingdom Egypt reached its peak under the great Ramesside pharaohs. Ramesses II, the ultimate builder, filled the country with monumental temples and colossal statues that proclaimed his divine power. His domains extended from Nubia in the south to Canaan in the north, controlling vital trade routes that linked Africa with Asia. Across the Mediterranean, in what we now know as Greece, the Mycenaean civilization flourished in cities like Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, and Tiryns. Their palaces were decorated with vibrant frescoes showing processions, hunts, and scenes of courtly life. Their warriors, later immortalized in Homer's epics, were feared throughout the Mediterranean. Further south, on the island of Crete, Minoan palaces like Knossos still maintained their cultural influence, though their golden age had passed. Their artisans created pottery of incomparable beauty. Their scribes recorded transactions in Linear A script that still challenges our full understanding today. On the eastern Mediterranean coast, prosperous Canaanite city-states like Ugarit, Byblos, and Sidon grew rich as intermediaries in international trade. Ugarit, in particular, was a cosmopolitan port where merchants from a dozen different nations haggled on its docks. Its archives, discovered in the 20th century, revealed an extraordinarily literate society that had developed one of the world's first alphabetic writing systems. Further east, in the land between the two rivers, Babylon and Assyria vied for dominance in Mesopotamia, heirs to millennia of Sumerian and Akkadian civilization. But what was truly revolutionary about this era wasn't just the existence of these great civilizations. It was how they were connected to each other. It was the network, the system, the interdependence that bound them into a single, pulsing organism. And it all started with a metal: bronze. This alloy of copper and tin was the foundational technology of the time, as crucial to that world as semiconductors are to ours. Weapons were made of bronze, agricultural tools were forged from bronze, statues of gods were cast in bronze, mirrors, jewelry, everyday utensils, all required this precious material. Without bronze, a civilization simply couldn't function. It couldn't defend itself, couldn't farm efficiently, couldn't trade on equal terms. Here's the key. Producing bronze required an international network. Copper was mainly mined from the pits of Cyprus, that Mediterranean island whose very name derives from the metal that made it famous. But tin, the essential component without which copper remained too soft to be useful, that tin came from incredibly distant places. Afghanistan was a major source, the lands that today make up Uzbekistan. possibly also from Cornwall in the British Isles, though this point is still debated among scholars. The crucial thing is this: no single kingdom controlled both resources. Everyone depended on long-distance trade to get the basic material of their civilization. The trade routes that sustained this system were true arteries of a global organism. Overland, caravans of hundreds of donkeys carried goods across mountains and deserts, following paths established for generations. Merchants knew every oasis, every mountain pass, every city where they could stop to rest and resupply. By sea, merchant ships with rounded hulls and square sails navigated from port to port, hugging the coasts or, when the weather allowed, crossing open water loaded to the brim with amphorae of wine, oil, and grain. The exchange of goods was astonishing in its scope and diversity. Amber, that fossilized resin of golden color formed in the forests of the Baltic thousands of kilometers to the north, embarked on an epic journey southward. It passed from hand to hand, from merchant to merchant, crossing all of Europe until it finally reached Egypt, where it adorned the necklaces of nobles and pharaohs. Phoenician purple, that extraordinarily costly dye extracted from thousands of murex snails, tinted the ceremonial robes of Hittite kings in Anatolia. Each kilo of dye required sacrificing about 10,000 snails, making purple fabrics literally more valuable than their weight in gold. African elephant ivory, carved by expert artisans into scenes of hunting and mythology, decorated the thrones and chests of Mycenaean palaces in Greece. Incense and myrrh from Arabia, aromatic resins burned in temples of all religions, reached the shrines of Crete and Egypt. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, that deep blue stone flecked with golden specks that seemed to contain the night sky, became jewelry for Egyptian queens and seals for Mesopotamian bureaucrats. Gold flowed in all directions, from Nubia to Egypt, from Egypt to Anatolia, from there to Greece, creating a circuit of wealth that enriched all participants. But perhaps nothing illustrates the sophistication of this international system better than the Amarna Letters. Discovered in 1887 by an Egyptian peasant woman at the site of Akhenaten's ancient capital, these clay tablets with cuneiform writing are one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of all time. They are real diplomatic correspondence, letters sent between the Egyptian pharaoh and the kings of practically all the great powers of the era. The letters reveal a surprisingly familiar diplomatic world. Monarchs addressed each other as brothers, a term implying equal status. "To my brother, the king of Egypt, greetings," begins a letter from the king of Babylon. This wasn't mere courtesy. It was the formal language of an international system, where the great kings recognized each other as peers, each sovereign in their territory, but bound to the others by ties of mutual respect and shared benefit. Dynastic marriages cemented these alliances. An Egyptian pharaoh might marry a Babylonian princess, sending massive amounts of gold in return as dowry and gifts. The letters discuss these exchanges with meticulous detail that sometimes comes across as comical. A Babylonian king complains bitterly that the gold sent by Egypt wasn't enough, and that it had been mixed with alloys reducing its purity. The pharaoh responds with indignation, insisting the gold was pure and plentiful. Another letter mentions a princess who never reached her destination, sparking a diplomatic crisis. The diplomatic gifts that accompanied these letters were spectacular. These weren't symbolic gestures, but massive shipments designed to impress and demonstrate power. A Hittite king sends the pharaoh 20 talents of pure copper. In response, the pharaoh sends solid gold statues, precious vases, and dozens of fine linen garments. A Cypriot king sends copper ingots shaped like stretched ox hides, each weighing about 30 kilos. These exchanges weren't simple gifts. They were statements of wealth, demonstrations of each kingdom's productive capacity, veiled warnings that economic power backed military might. The letters also coordinated policies. When a vassal king rebelled, monarchs wrote to each other to coordinate a joint response. When a common threat arose, they discussed strategies. When famine struck one kingdom, another sent emergency grain. This was a sophisticated political system with understood rules, established protocols, and mechanisms of cooperation that maintained international order. The urban prosperity this system generated was unprecedented in human history up to that point. Cities that now lie in ruins were then bustling cosmopolitan centers teeming with life. Mycenaean, perched on a fortified hill in the Greek Peloponnese, dominated the surrounding plains with its cyclopean walls, blocks of stone so massive that later generations believed only mythical giants could have placed them. Its monumental gates, including the famous Lion Gate with its relief of two lionesses flanking a sacred column, announced the power and glory of the kingdom. Inside the walls, the Megaron Palace housed the Wonax, the divine king whose authority was absolute. The palace storerooms overflowed with olive oil in enormous ceramic jars, grain stored in underground silos, polished bronze weapons ready to arm the warriors. Scribes recorded every transaction on clay tablets using Linear B script, a syllabary adapted from the Cretan Minoans to write an early form of Greek. These tablets, preserved accidentally when the palaces burned and baked the clay, allow us today to read exact inventories. So many sheep, so much wheat, so much bronze, assigned to such artisan or such military unit. Thebes in Egypt, the city of 100 gates, according to Homer, sprawled across both banks of the Nile. On the east bank, the massive temples of Karnak and Luxor dominated the urban landscape. Their columns, carved to resemble bundles of papyrus or lotus flowers, rose skyward, supporting roofs decorated with golden stars on a deep blue background. The walls were covered in painted reliefs showing the pharaoh smiting enemies, offering to the gods, presiding over religious festivals. On the west bank, the Valley of the Kings housed the royal tombs, excavated deep into the mountain and decorated with scenes of the soul's journey through the underworld. Hattusa, the Hittite capital in central Anatolia, was a marvel of defensive engineering. Situated on rugged, rocky terrain, the city was protected by a double wall system stretching over 6 kilometers. The fortifications included regularly spaced watchtowers, monumental gates decorated with reliefs of sphinxes and warriors, and an ingenious system of underground tunnels that allowed defenders to secretly exit outside the walls to attack besiegers. The Great Temple, dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess, covered more than a hectare, and its storerooms could feed the population during a prolonged siege. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, was perhaps the most cosmopolitan of all these cities. Its deep, natural harbor attracted ships from all over the Mediterranean. In its streets, dozens of different languages were heard. Archaeologists have found texts in Ugaritic, Akkadian, Hurrian, Hittite, Cypriot, Egyptian, and Sumerian. The city was a cultural melting pot where traditions from multiple civilizations blended and fused. Its artisans produced objects that combined techniques and styles from different cultures. A ceramic jug might have a Mycenaean shape, but Egyptian decoration. A tablet might be written in Akkadian, but using the newly invented Ugaritic alphabet. What made this prosperity possible was the level of administrative organization. The palace economies of the Bronze Age were highly centralized systems where the state controlled virtually every aspect of production, storage, and distribution of resources. The palace wasn't just the king's residence, it was the economic, political, religious, and administrative center of the entire kingdom. In Mycenae, the Linear B tablets allow us to reconstruct this system in astonishing detail. The palace owned extensive lands that it leased to farmers in exchange for a portion of the harvest. It controlled flocks of sheep numbered in the thousands, recording how much wool each flock produced and how much was allocated to textile production. Specialized artisans, from blacksmiths to potters, from carpenters to goldsmiths, worked for the palace or under its direct supervision. They received rations of food and raw materials, and in return had to deliver a quota of finished products. Bronze production was particularly centralized. The palace controlled the supply of copper and tin, those precious metals imported from so far away. Blacksmiths received exact amounts of metal, measured and recorded meticulously. They had to produce a specific number of spear points, swords, agricultural tools. Palace inspectors verified that no metal was wasted or diverted. The system was so rigorous that some tablets recurred down to the last scrap of bronze recycled from broken tools. Textile production was another massive industry controlled by the palace. Groups of women workers, some free but many likely war captives, carded wool, spun fibers, wove cloth on upright looms. The tablets record specific work groups assigned to named supervisors, producing set amounts of fabric in different qualities. Fine cloths dyed with purple or decorated with gold were destined for export or elite use. Ordinary cloths clothed the common population or were traded in bulk. Olive oil was another crucial product. Mycenaean palaces owned extensive olive groves. During harvest season, organized crews picked the olives, which were then pressed in centralized facilities. The oil was stored in huge jars called pithoi, some so large an adult man could stand inside. This oil had multiple uses, food of course, but also lighting in lamps, cosmetic ointments, and religious rituals. Some was consumed locally, some stored as reserves for hard times, some exported in exchange for goods the kingdom needed. This level of control required an extensive bureaucracy. Scribes were crucial figures, literate individuals who spent years learning the complex writing system. In Mycenaean palaces, they wrote in linear B on wet clay tablets using pointed styluses. The tablets weren't meant for permanent preservation, but were temporary records, working documents discarded at the end of each fiscal year. They only survived because the palaces burned, accidentally baking the clay and preserving the documents for eternity. The archives of Ugarit reveal an equally complex bureaucracy. Thousands of cuneiform tablets record commercial contracts, tribute lists, warehouse inventories, administrative correspondence, royal decrees, legal documents. We can track specific court cases, disputes over property boundaries, lawsuits for breach of contract. We see how the king mediated conflicts, how merchants formed trading partnerships, how powerful families accumulated wealth and land across generations. But what's most revealing is how this documentation shows the systemic interdependence of the Bronze Age world. No kingdom was self-sufficient. Each depended on the others in fundamental ways. Cyprus produced copper in abundance, but needed to import practically everything else. Grain from Egypt to feed its mining population, pottery from Greece because its own potters couldn't meet demand, luxury goods from everywhere. Egypt was rich in gold, but lacked suitable building timber for large ships and monumental buildings, depending on cedar imports from Lebanon. Hittite kingdoms controlled crucial trade routes, but needed constant grain imports because their Anatolian plateau, while suitable for herding, wasn't particularly productive for agriculture. Mycenaean cities exported olive oil, wine, and fine pottery, but absolutely depended on metal imports. Greece has little native copper and virtually no tin. Without massive imports of these metals, Mycenaean civilization simply couldn't exist. Its warriors wouldn't have weapons, its artisans wouldn't have tools, its agriculture would be primitive, the whole system would crumble. This interdependence created powerful incentives to maintain peace and fluid trade. Wars between great powers were relatively rare because everyone lost when trade was disrupted. When conflicts arose, like the prolonged rivalry between Egypt and the Hittite Empire, they were eventually resolved through diplomatic treaties. The famous Treaty of Kadesh between Rameses II and Hittite King Hattusili III, signed after decades of conflict, established borders, mutual defensive alliances, and trade agreements. It's considered one of the first international peace treaties in history, and copies have been found in both Egypt and Anatolia, written in hieroglyphs and cuneiform. Aid during crises demonstrated this interdependence in action. The Amarna Letters include correspondence about emergency grain shipments. A kingdom hit by drought or locust plagues could request help from its brother kings. They generally responded because they knew they might need similar aid one day. A Hittite king writes to the pharaoh requesting grain because famine threatens his kingdom. The pharaoh responds by sending loaded ships. This wasn't simple charity, it was system preservation. If one kingdom collapsed from famine, its neighbors lost a trading partner, routes were disrupted, and the domino effect could eventually reach them. Military alliances further reinforced the system. When external threats arose, the great kingdoms coordinated responses. Treaties included mutual defense clauses. If one kingdom was attacked, its allies were obligated to send troops. This meant that aggressing against one member of the system potentially meant facing a coalition of multiple great powers, a powerful deterrent. Technology was shared and diffused rapidly through the system. Innovations in metallurgy developed in one kingdom soon appeared in others. Pottery designs were copied and imitated. Architectural techniques traveled with itinerant craftsmen. The alphabetic writing invented in Ugarit was adopted and adapted by the Phoenicians, from whom it would eventually pass to the Greeks, and thence to the entire Western world. Even religious ideas circulated. Gods from one pantheon were identified with gods from another. The Hittite storm god was equated with Greek Zeus and Canaanite Baal. Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar merged with Phoenician Astarte and Greek Aphrodite. Myths traveled and transformed. The Epic of Gilgamesh, originating in Mesopotamia, has been found in translated versions in Hittite and Hurrian. Stories of dying and resurrecting gods, the theme of cataclysmic flood, tales of heroes seeking immortality, all these mythological motifs circulated throughout the cultural system. This interconnected world reached its peak around the 13th century BC. Cities had never been larger, trade had never been more extensive, prosperity had never reached such heights. Palaces were built bigger than ever. Archives document dense populations, massive productions, constant exchanges. And yet, precisely at the moment of greatest splendor, the seeds of destruction were already germinating. The system had become so complex, so specialized, so interdependent, that its very stability turned into fragility. It was like a building constructed ever higher without reinforcing the foundations. Each year of success added another flaw, making the structure more impressive but also more vulnerable. A tremor that 50 years ago would have been barely noticeable could now trigger a catastrophic collapse. The palace elites controlled more resources than ever, but that meant a larger portion of the population depended completely on the centralized system to survive. Specialized artisans no longer knew how to grow their own food. Port cities relied on constant grain imports. Economies specialized in exporting a single product were extremely vulnerable to disruptions. Trade routes had become so extensive that any interruption at one point could have cascading effects across the entire system. A sunk ship wasn't just a local loss, but could mean a workshop on the other side of the Mediterranean ran out of raw materials. A war in a border region could close crucial passes and divert caravans, causing shortages in half a dozen kingdoms. Specialization had reached levels where reverting to self-sufficiency was practically impossible. A city that had spent generations specializing in fine pottery for export couldn't just decide one day to become self-sufficient. It didn't have the farmland, the experience, the infrastructure. It depended absolutely on the trade system for survival. And so, while kings congratulated each other in their diplomatic letters, while merchants grew rich with every successful voyage, while scribes recorded ever more impressive production figures, the system itself became increasingly fragile. More efficient, yes, but also more vulnerable. Richer, without doubt, but also more dependent, more connected than ever, which meant that when it started to fail, the failure would spread faster and farther than ever before in human history. No one saw it coming. Or maybe some sensed it but couldn't do anything about it. Because by the time the problems became obvious, it was already too late. The forces that would destroy this world were already in motion, converging from multiple directions, preparing to unleash a perfect storm that would erase centuries of civilization in just a few decades. The bronze gleamed in the arsenals, the storerooms overflowed, the merchant fleets plied the seas, the palaces stood proud. Everything seemed eternal. Everything seemed invincible. It wasn't. 1177 BC, that date, proposed by archaeologist Eric Cline, marks the turning point, the year the ancient world began to unravel. But the destruction wasn't instantaneous. It was something much worse. It was slow, chaotic, unstoppable. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 BC, the world system we've just described collapsed catastrophically and simultaneously across the eastern Mediterranean region. It wasn't a gradual decline. It wasn't an orderly transition. It was a catastrophe of apocalyptic proportions that destroyed entire civilizations, erased centuries of accumulated knowledge, and plunged whole regions into a dark age that would last 300 years. The physical devastation was absolute. Dozens of cities from Greece to the Levant were destroyed and burned. Most were never rebuilt. Site after site, archaeologists find the same chilling evidence: thick layers of black ash, toppled walls, collapsed buildings, unburied bodies. The archaeological record shows destruction so complete it's hard to comprehend. We're not talking about one city destroyed here, another there. We're talking about the systematic annihilation of an entire civilization across thousands of kilometers. Let's start with Ugarit because its fate perfectly illustrates the tragedy. This prosperous coastal city-state, that cultural melting pot where dozens of traditions blended, was razed so completely that it vanished from history for millennia. When archaeologists finally discovered it in 1928, they found something extraordinary: a cuneiform tablet still in the kiln where it was being baked when the city was attacked. The message is desperate. It's from a Ugarit official to his counterpart in Cyprus. "My father, behold, the enemy ships have come. They have burned my cities with fire and have done evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in Hittite land, and all my ships are in Lycian land? They have not returned yet, so the country is abandoned to its fate. Let my father know this. The 7 enemy ships that came here have inflicted much damage on us." This is one of the last messages written before Ugarit was completely destroyed. It never recovered. The site was abandoned. The sophisticated city that had been a center of trade and culture for centuries simply ceased to exist. Its inhabitants were wiped out or scattered. Its language stopped being spoken. Its brilliant alphabetic script was lost for centuries until rediscovered by modern archaeologists. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece suffered a similar fate. The palaces that had dominated the landscape for centuries were destroyed one after another. Pylos, with its beautiful palace decorated with frescoes of griffins and processions, burned so intensely that the stone walls cracked from the heat. The clay tablets in its archives were accidentally baked, preserving them for us, but the city itself never recovered. Mycenae, the mighty fortress that names the entire civilization, was attacked and severely damaged. Though it initially survived, its power was broken. Tiryns faced repeated destructions. Thebes was razed. Archaeology reveals that after these destructions, Greece experienced a catastrophic population collapse. Estimates suggest the population may have declined by up to 90% in some regions. 90%. The great fortified cities were abandoned. People dispersed to small, isolated settlements in remote mountainous areas. Linear B writing disappeared completely. Greece became illiterate and remained so for centuries. Monumental art ceased. Stone masonry architecture vanished. Building techniques regressed centuries. The Hittite Empire, that superpower that had rivaled Egypt for dominance in the Near East, simply vanished. The capital Hattusa was abandoned. Hittite historical records end abruptly. Hittite cities across Anatolia were destroyed. The centralized state disintegrated completely. Regions that had been part of the empire fell into chaos. Populations wandered seeking refuge. Political continuity was broken so completely that when new states arose in the region centuries later, they remembered nothing of the great empire that had existed there. In the Levant, the destruction was equally devastating. Beyond Ugarit, other major cities were razed. Megiddo, that strategic city that had existed for millennia, was destroyed. Hazor, one of the largest cities in Canaan, was burned so intensely that the destruction layer is several meters thick. Lachish, Ashkelon, Ashdod, all faced massive destruction. Only Egypt survived relatively intact, but even mighty Egypt suffered enormously. The inscriptions of Pharaoh Ramesses III, who ruled during this catastrophic period, describe massive attacks by enemies coming by sea and land. The reliefs on his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu show naval and land battles against foreign invaders. Egypt managed to repel these attacks, but the effort exhausted the kingdom. After Ramesses III, Egypt entered a long decline. It lost its possessions in Canaan. Its power diminished. Central authority weakened. Though it survived as a civilization, it never regained the regional dominance it had exercised during the New Kingdom. So what caused this unprecedented catastrophe? For decades, scholars have debated this question, and the answer that's emerged is unsettling in its complexity. There wasn't a single cause. It was a convergence of multiple disasters that reinforced each other until they created a perfect storm that no individual civilization could withstand. Eric Cline and other researchers have identified at least 5 major factors: natural catastrophes, specifically earthquakes, climate change that triggered severe droughts and famines, internal rebellions and social conflicts, invasions by groups known as the Sea Peoples, and disruption of international trade networks. Each of these factors alone would have been a serious challenge. Together, converging in the space of a few decades, they were utterly devastating. Let's start with climate change, because the evidence here is damning and comes from modern science. Paleoclimatologists have studied sediment cores extracted from the bottom of the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. These sediments accumulate layer by layer, year by year, over millennia. By analyzing the pollen preserved in each layer, scientists can reconstruct what plants grew in different periods, which in turn reveals how much rain fell. The results are clear and alarming. Around 1200 BC, right at the start of the collapse, the pollen record shows a dramatic shift. Plants that require abundant rain decrease precipitously. Plants adapted to arid conditions increase. The evidence points to a severe and prolonged drought that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean region for decades. This wasn't an ordinary drought of 1 or 2 bad years. It was a fundamental climate shift that lasted generations. Scientists have identified the mechanism behind this change. The North Atlantic climate system underwent a reorganization that diverted the winter storms that normally brought rain to the eastern Mediterranean. These storms began veering north of the Pyrenees and Alps, bringing wetter conditions to Central Europe, but devastating drought to the south and east. The Mediterranean itself cooled. Sea surface temperatures before 1190 BC dropped significantly. This is crucial because sea temperature controls evaporation. A cooler Mediterranean evaporates less water. Westerly winds that normally pick up that evaporated moisture and carry it inland transported less water vapor. When these winds hit coastal mountains and rose, cooling and releasing their moisture as rain, there simply wasn't enough moisture to produce normal precipitation. The cascading consequences of this drought were catastrophic. Bronze Age agriculture depended entirely on seasonal rains. There were no extensive irrigation systems like in Mesopotamia or Egypt. Crops failed year after year. Fields dried up. Streams and springs ran dry. Livestock died from lack of pasture and water. Famine spread. And here's the crucial part. The world system we've described, that system so efficient and so specialized, became a death trap. Densely populated cities couldn't feed themselves even in the best of times. They relied on constant grain imports. When crops failed simultaneously across the region, There was nowhere to import from. Palace storerooms depleted. Hunger set in. Egyptian inscriptions from this period repeatedly mention famine. Ramesses III boasts of feeding his people during years of scarcity, distributing grain from royal stores. But even Egypt, with the Nile as a reliable water source, faced hardships. Regions dependent solely on rain suffered far worse. Letters from the late Hittite archives mention desperate requests for grain. A Hittite king writes to a ruler in Ugarit demanding immediate grain shipments because famine threatens his kingdom. Another letter orders all available grain to be sent by ship immediately because it is a matter of life or death. The tone of these letters reveals barely contained panic. Prolonged famine has effects that go far beyond simple hunger. Weakened populations are vulnerable to disease. Plagues likely spread, though direct evidence is limited because diseases rarely leave traces in the archaeological record. Severe malnutrition in children causes permanent damage to physical and intellectual development. Infant mortality rates skyrocket. The working capacity of the adult population declines. Societies enter a downward spiral of progressive weakening. But climate wasn't acting alone. Earthquakes added another layer of destruction. Seismic evidence shows that the eastern Mediterranean experienced what scientists call an earthquake storm during this period. This region lies in a seismically active zone where multiple tectonic plates meet. Normally, earthquakes occur irregularly, spread out over decades and centuries, but occasionally, accumulated stress releases in a series of major earthquakes, concentrated in a short period. This is exactly what seems to have happened around 1200 BC. Site after site shows evidence of seismic damage. Collapsed walls, toppled columns, sunken buildings. Crucially, this seismic destruction precedes the ash layers from burning. In other words, earthquakes struck first, weakening city defenses, and then came the attacks that burned them. Earthquakes destroyed critical infrastructure. Water systems supplying cities broke, cisterns cracked, aqueducts collapsed. In a region already hit by drought, losing water storage and distribution systems was devastating. Defensive walls cracked or crumbled, leaving cities vulnerable to attack. Grain storerooms collapsed, destroying precious reserves that could have helped populations survive famine. Think about the situation from the perspective of a typical city of the time. Drought has reduced harvests for several consecutive years. Reserves are running low. The population is starving and desperate. Then a major earthquake hits. Walls crack. Buildings collapse. People die under rubble. Water systems break. Grain reserves stored in now ruined buildings are lost or contaminated. The city's ability to defend itself is compromised. And at this moment of maximum vulnerability, the Sea Peoples arrived. This is perhaps the most mysterious and debated aspect of the collapse. Who exactly were they? Egyptian sources mention them but don't fully explain, probably because to contemporary Egyptian scribes they were well known and didn't need elaboration. Ramesses III's inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe them as a confederation of different groups: the Peliset, Jeka, Shekelesh, Denian, Weshesh, and others. Some of these names can be tentatively connected to later known peoples. The Peliset likely became the Philistines who appear in biblical texts. The Shekelesh perhaps related to Sicily. The Denian might be the Danaans, a Homeric name for Greeks. But these identifications are speculative and controversial. What we know for sure is that these groups came in massive numbers. Egyptian reliefs show them traveling in ships and ox-drawn carts, bringing entire families, men, women, children. These weren't raiding parties, they were migrations, whole populations on the move, seeking new lands to settle. The reliefs depict massive naval battles in the Nile Delta. Egyptian ships, with their distinctive curved hulls and multiple oars, face off against the invaders' vessels. Egyptian archers fire clouds of arrows. Enemy ships sink or are boarded. On land, the Egyptian army, with its disciplined infantry and war chariots, confronts the invading hordes. The Sea Peoples fight fiercely, but are eventually defeated by Egypt's organized military power. But here's the crucial question. Why did they come? What set them in motion? The most convincing modern theory is that they themselves were victims of climate change. The drought affecting the eastern Mediterranean also hit their homelands, probably in the Aegean, western Anatolia, and Mediterranean islands. Their crops failed. Their societies collapsed. They had no choice but to migrate east and south, seeking more fertile lands, seeking survival. But in migrating, these climate refugees found kingdoms already teetering on the edge of collapse, kingdoms weakened by years of famine, their defenses compromised by earthquakes, their economies in crisis simply couldn't resist these mass migrations. Cities fell one after another, palaces were looted, populations were wiped out or scattered. And this is where the systemic nature of the Bronze Age world became its greatest weakness. Each destruction triggered cascading effects. When Ugarit fell, its role as a crucial trading port vanished. Merchant ships that normally stopped there had to find alternative routes or simply stop trading. When Mycenaean cities were destroyed, their production of olive oil and fine pottery ceased. Kingdoms that imported these goods faced shortages. Italian historian Mario Liverani has argued that the extreme centralization of palace economies amplified the disaster's magnitude. Everything flowed to and from the palace. When the palace collapsed, the entire regional economic system collapsed with it. Specialized artisans who depended on the palace for raw materials and product distribution were left resourceless. Farmers who leased land from the palace faced uncertainty about their rights. Merchants operating under palace licenses lost their legal authority. The collapse of international trade was particularly devastating due to the dependence on bronze. Christopher Monroe has extensively studied the bronze economy in the late Bronze Age. His argument is that society was built entirely on this metal. Weapons, tools, agricultural implements all required bronze, and producing bronze required tin. When trade routes were disrupted, the tin supply was cut off. Remember, tin came from distant places: Afghanistan, Central Asia, possibly Cornwall. These long trade routes were vulnerable to any instability. Merchants wouldn't risk their caravans in conflict zones. Sea routes became dangerous as pirates and refugees infested the waters. Without tin, no new bronze could be produced. Societies had to rely increasingly on recycling old bronze. But this was insufficient. The amount of available bronze decreased. Weapons became scarce. Tools wore out without replacement. Society's productive capacity declined. Military capability weakened. Already weakened societies became even more vulnerable. Monroe argues that this dependence on a material requiring complex international trade created a fundamental systemic vulnerability. It was like building an entire civilization on imported oil in our modern world. While imports flowed, everything worked perfectly. But when disrupted, the entire system crumbled. And so, one factor reinforced another in a vicious downward circle. Drought caused famine. Hunger weakened populations. Earthquakes destroyed infrastructure. Weakened defenses couldn't resist the sea peoples. Destroyed cities could no longer participate in trade. Trade collapse cut off essential materials. Resource scarcity caused more conflicts. Conflicts disrupted trade even further. Each problem worsened all the others. Eric Cline synthesizes all this in his theory of systemic collapse. The central argument is that no single cause explains the catastrophe. Not climate change alone, not earthquakes alone, not the sea peoples alone, not trade collapse alone. It was the simultaneous combination of multiple factors operating on a highly complex and interconnected system. To understand this, Cline draws on complexity theory and complex adaptive systems. When a system becomes highly complex, with multiple interconnected components, where each part depends on many others, the system becomes simultaneously more efficient and more fragile. It's more efficient because specialization allows each component to optimize for its specific function. But it's more fragile because a failure in any component can propagate through the connections, causing cascading failures. The Bronze Age world was exactly this kind of system. It was incredibly efficient. Cities specialized in specific functions. Trade distributed resources optimally. Centralized palace economies coordinated production and distribution. Everything worked wonderfully well while conditions were favorable. But this complexity and interdependence meant the system lacked resilience. There was no redundancy, no backup capacity. When one part failed, there was no alternative. When Ugarit was destroyed, there was no other port that could immediately assume its role. When tin supply was cut, there was no easily accessible alternative source. When a palace collapsed, the entire region depending on it descended into chaos. British archaeologist Colin Renfrew has identified the characteristic features of complex civilization collapse. First, the collapse of central administrative authority. Palaces and their bureaucracies disappear. The centralized state fragments. Second, the disappearance of the traditional elite class. Kings, nobles, high officials all lose their position. Third, the breakdown of the centralized economy. Organized production and coordinated distribution cease. Finally, changes in settlement patterns with severe population decline. Great cities are abandoned. Population disperses to smaller settlements. Each of these features is visible in the Bronze Age collapse. Palaces were destroyed and never rebuilt. Writing disappeared, taking with it the administrative capacity that required literacy. Elites who had ruled for generations vanished from the historical record. Massive cities were abandoned in favor of small, scattered villages, but the process wasn't instantaneous. This is a crucial point that's often misunderstood. It wasn't an apocalypse that happened in a single year. It was a disintegration that unfolded over decades, perhaps even a full century, depending on the specific region. Different areas collapsed at slightly different times. Some cities fell early, others held out longer. There were periods of acute crisis separated by intervals of partial recovery. Some regions experienced multiple waves of destruction spaced years or decades apart. It wasn't a single event, but a chaotic process of progressive disintegration. Contemporary sources, when they exist, show that people of the time were aware something terrible was happening, but didn't necessarily grasp the full magnitude. The desperate letters from Ugarit show awareness of an immediate threat, but not that the entire civilization was collapsing. Egyptian scribes recorded victories over the sea peoples, but probably didn't realize entire kingdoms to the north were vanishing. And gradually, over decades of recurrent crises, the world system simply unraveled. Trade routes that had connected civilizations were severed. Ships stopped sailing between distant ports because those ports no longer existed or were too dangerous. Land caravans ceased because roads were infested with bandits, and the safe stop cities lay in ruins. Population declined drastically. Estimates vary, but archaeological studies of settlement patterns suggest the eastern Mediterranean population may have fallen by 50 to 70% in many areas. In some regions, like Greece, the decline may have been even worse. This doesn't necessarily mean everyone died. Many probably migrated. Others dispersed from dense cities to small rural communities that are less archaeologically visible. But the result was the same. The urban world of the late Bronze Age vanished. The long-term consequences were profound and lasting. What followed is what historians call the Mediterranean Dark Age, a period of roughly 300 years, from about 1150 to 850 BC, when civilization levels regressed dramatically. In Greece, this period is particularly dark. Linear B writing disappeared completely. Greece became illiterate. It wouldn't have writing again until adopting the Phoenician alphabet centuries later. Monumental architecture ceased. Dark Age Greeks didn't build stone palaces or temples. They lived in simple wood and mud structures. Art reverted to basic forms. The beautiful Mycenaean ceramics, with their sophisticated designs, were replaced by handmade pottery with simple geometric decoration. Long-distance trade virtually disappeared. Exotic objects that had flowed across the Mediterranean became extremely rare. Communities became self-sufficient by necessity, not choice. They produced what they needed locally or simply did without. Living standards declined. Specialization vanished. The village blacksmith had to do everything, couldn't specialize in fine work like the palace artisans of old. Technical knowledge was lost. Complex metalworking techniques developed over centuries disappeared. The ability to build in worked stone was forgotten. Writing systems were lost. Whole generations grew up not knowing their ancestors had magnificent palaces, extensive archives, trade networks spanning continents. But here's something fascinating. Cultural memory persisted in transformed form. Stories from the palace era survived in oral tradition, distorted and mythologized, but preserving fragments of historical truth. Centuries later, when Greeks finally had writing again, these oral stories were committed to text by poets like Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey, composed probably in the 8th century BC, tell stories set in the Mycenaean era. Homer describes palaces, bronze weapons, massive shields, warriors in chariots, exactly the things that characterized the Mycenaean world of the Bronze Age. He didn't know he was describing a world that had vanished 400 years before his time. To him, they were just the ancient tales that were told. But modern archaeologists have been amazed to discover how much of what Homer describes matches late Bronze Age realities. Schliemann, the 19th century archaeologist who excavated Mycenae and Troy, was convinced Homer described real events. Most scholars of his era considered him naive. They believed Homer had invented everything. But Schliemann discovered that a civilization in Greece existed that matched Homeric descriptions. The Cyclopean walls were there. The palaces with their treasures existed. There was evidence of connections with Anatolia that made conflicts between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian cities plausible. Now we understand that Homer preserved, in mythic and distorted form, cultural memories of the Mycenaean civilization and its collapse. The Trojan War, if it happened, was likely one of the final conflicts of the Mycenaean era. The description of Odysseus's wandering return through danger-infested seas might reflect the chaotic conditions of the Mediterranean during and after the collapse. In other regions, the decline took different forms. Egypt survived as a civilization, but entered a long period of weakening. After Ramesses III, pharaohs became weaker. Egypt lost its foreign possessions. Priestly power in Thebes rivaled the pharaoh. Eventually, Egypt fragmented into multiple competing power centers during the Third Intermediate Period. Anatolia, where the Hittite Empire had been, fragmented into small kingdoms and principalities. Political continuity was broken. New states that eventually arose had no direct connection to the Hittites. The Hittite language stopped being spoken. Hittite cuneiform writing disappeared. When centuries later archaeologists discovered Hattusa's ruins, they initially didn't know what civilization had built them. The Levant experienced massive population rearrangements. The Philistines, likely descendants of the sea peoples Egypt had defeated, settled on Canaan's southern coast. Phoenicians emerged on the northern coast, heirs to Canaanite traditions, but forming new political identities centered on city-states like Tyre and Sidon. In the interior, new groups like the Israelites began establishing communities in the highlands. Mesopotamia, partially protected by its distance from the worst collapse effects, maintained more continuity. But even there, significant disruptions occurred. Trade with the West was cut off. Dynasties changed. Power fluctuated between different urban centers. The world that eventually emerged after the Dark Age was fundamentally different from the one that had collapsed. When civilization recovered and trade gradually resumed from the 9th century BC onward, the system was less centralized. Instead of large empires with palace economies controlled by bureaucracies, networks of more independent city-states arose. The Phoenicians became the preeminent maritime traders, establishing colonies and trading posts across the Mediterranean. But their trading system was different from the old one. It was less centralized, based on private mercantile enterprises rather than direct palace control. The Greeks, finally emerging from their Dark Age, adopted a similar model of independent city-states that competed and traded with each other. Iron gradually replaced bronze as the foundational technological metal. Iron was harder to work, requiring higher temperatures to forge. But iron ore was much more common than copper, and especially tin. Once techniques were mastered, iron allowed producing tools and weapons locally without depending on complex international trade networks. This created less interdependent economic systems, more resilient to disruptions. Alphabetic writing, initially developed in Ugarit and refined by the Phoenicians, spread widely. It was much easier to learn than syllabic scripts like Linear B or complex cuneiform systems. This democratized literacy. No longer did you need to be a professional scribe trained for years to read and write. Merchants, artisans, even farmers could become literate. This decentralized knowledge and power. So what lessons can we draw from this ancient catastrophe? Eric Cline argues that the Bronze Age collapse should serve as a warning for our modern world. The similarities are unsettling. Our world is highly globalized, with supply chains spanning the planet. We depend on international trade networks for essential resources. Our economy is highly specialized, with entire regions dedicated to producing certain products while importing everything else. Our systems are complex and interconnected, where a failure in one part can propagate quickly. And we face similar threats to those that destroyed the Bronze Age world. Climate change threatens massive disruptions to agriculture and habitability. Mass migrations caused by climate change, conflicts, or economic collapse can destabilize entire regions. Disruptions to international trade, whether from conflicts, pandemics, or economic crises, can have cascading effects. Natural disasters, from earthquakes to pandemics, can strike already stressed systems. The crucial difference is that now we're aware of these risks. We have science that can predict and model these phenomena. We have technology that can help us adapt. We have international institutions designed to coordinate responses to global crises. But we also have a system much more complex and interconnected than the Bronze Age one, meaning the cascading effects of any failure could be even faster and more extensive. The Bronze Age collapse shows that even the most advanced, prosperous, seemingly stable civilizations can crumble when multiple crises converge on complex systems without enough resilience. It demonstrates the dangers of overdependence on centralized systems without redundancy. It illustrates how globalization without resilience mechanisms creates systemic vulnerabilities. It reveals how climate change can trigger cascades of secondary effects that amplify the initial crisis. 1177 BC, a year that changed the world. A reminder that no civilization is eternal. That complexity brings efficiency, but also fragility. That we must build resilience into our systems, not just efficiency. That we must prepare for converging crises, not just individual threats. The Bronze Age world shone with unprecedented splendor. Its cities stood proud. Its trade connected continents. Its palaces housed incredible treasures. And then, in the space of a few decades, it all vanished under the ashes. Cities burned, networks collapsed. Civilization regressed centuries. It would take generations before the Mediterranean saw such prosperity again. And when it finally did, it was a different world, built on the ruins of the old, bearing scars from the collapse, but also perhaps somewhat wiser about the dangers of building towers too high on foundations too fragile. This is the story of how the first globalized world came crashing down, a warning from the depths of time, a lesson that echoes across 3,000 years to our interconnected and vulnerable present. Because the question the Bronze Age collapse poses to us is simple but terrifying. If it happened to them, could it happen to us? If this story of ancient collapse has you thinking about our own world, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's biggest mysteries. We've got plenty more coming your way. And if you're hooked on these tales of lost civilizations, hit subscribe now to stay in the loop on all our upcoming episodes. For more insights like this into how history repeats itself, make sure you're subscribed. It's the best way to catch every new video. Finally, if you've enjoyed this journey through the Bronze Age, subscribe today and join our community of history enthusiasts exploring the past together.